Hi, I've just cleaned all my spray guns and I'm ready for the big video shoot today. This video on spray finishing basics should help you learn to go about a simple small shop spray setup, building your own booth for example. It'll teach you about the various types of spray guns, from a door jamb to a production, the HVLP, even the little airbrush. We'll start out with wood preparation, where we scrape and sand and fill the open pored woods. Then we're going to spray a clear finish in lacquer, also in hydrocoat, the water-based finish. When that's dry, we'll wet sand and rub the finish out. Before we start out, I want to show you around my shop, which is a 16.5 foot by 11 foot one-car garage that I've converted into a repair shop. Here's my shop. I'm standing out here in the driveway. There's the two steel doors I put up. I'll take you right inside. It's not a big building. This was an old Model A garage. That's my spray booth and a couple of cabinets I keep the flammables in here. Got a milling machine at the other end. Back there in the corner is the door that goes into the house, and you may recognize the workbench from the catalog. Got my roll-around tool chest there, and those are my victims hanging from the ceiling. It's not very big, but it does the job. To assemble the booth, I've got steel pins on each side of the window, 2 of them, and I hang 1/2-inch Celotex from them. There's holes drilled in the Celotex. There's a total of 4 pins in all that this hangs on. It's very light and it goes together real fast. This panel comes out, the top panel comes out, and the whole thing's held together with this bungee clamp. This is my work table here. It's built right in front of the spray fan, so any sawdust goes right out the window, and it's built on top of my belt sander. When I want to use the belt sander, I can pop this table off. Otherwise, it stays on, and I do all my sanding and gun cleaning and wood preparation here. I have an explosion-proof motor here built into a metal enclosure. They both came from the Grainger company, and they're made by Dayton. In the wintertime, I'll put some 2-inch insulation in the window to keep out the cold. And whenever I spray, I put a furnace filter in there. I built it into a little wooden rack. It's about 2 inches thick, and if you take it outdoors and clean it every couple of weeks, it lasts quite a while. You can blow the dust off. It just catches all your overspray. Let's make some dust now, some sawdust, by preparing those bodies I showed you earlier for spraying. I sort of do my sanding, steaming, and scraping all as one operation, going all the way around the body. What I'm doing here is steaming out some dents. If you'll come in a little closer, I'll show you what I mean. Just a damp rag and a hot soldering iron will steam those dents out of the wood. The wood's still there, it's just been crunched in. See the scratches going up and down sideways on the rim here? You can sand those out, but often on exposed grain like that, sandpaper will kind of dull it and scratch the surface. That's where I use a scraper blade. The scraper comes in real handy for making the wood look sharp and clean for a clear finish. Sometimes you'll actually flex a blade in a curve to get into a certain area. The scraper is the right tool on end grain and side grain especially, and for keeping a really clean look. Can you see how much cleaner the grain looks here where I scraped it right next to this area where I sanded it? It looks a lot more dull and fuzzy. That isn't to say that I don't use sandpaper, because I do. Always on the corners, often on the flats, although I'll scrape the flats too. Often in the cutaways where it's hard to scrape. Right now I'm using a 220 grit free cut paper. That's sort of the bluish colored stuff. I'll show you a bit about sandpaper in a minute. There's so many different types of sandpaper it could almost be confusing. The most common types that I use are the no-fill or free-cut papers that tend to be the bluish or gray color. I use grits anywhere from 80 grit on up to 500. The most common grits for wood sanding would be 120, 220, and 320. At that point you're generally ready to spray. This is a 180 no-fill, and no-fill paper comes in round discs that you use on a dual action sander. No-fill paper comes in rolls that you can use on a Rockwell block sander. There's also a gold-colored no-fill paper that comes in the same form, and this is sold at a lot of body shops. It doesn't leave any marks on the wood. Sometimes the blue paper tends to leave blackish marks on maple. You might check into the gold paper at your auto parts store. There's nothing wrong with brown paper that you find in the hardware store. It's your basic production paper. Let me show you some of my sanding machines. The Rockwell 4-inch speed block sander model 330 is a really great sander, and I've used one for many years and swear by it. One problem that it has is that it leaves little teeny circular orbital marks. This is an orbital sander, and you'll have to work them out by hand. Here's a sander that doesn't leave any marks. It's the dual action or DA sander. While it's going around, it makes sort of an orbital motion at the same time and takes out its own scratches. It can leave marks, however, on the edge. If you tilt it too far, you'll get a dip in your wood. So you try to hold a DA sander fairly flat to the surface as you work. No matter what kind of power sander you use, you should probably finish up by hand using a flat block and sandpaper, or perhaps a scraper. I often use a Meguiar's rubber backing pad, or a block of wood with leather glued to it. You want to keep the sanding flat. If you use your fingers with a piece of sandpaper, you run the risk of getting little dents from your fingertips. You want to keep the wood flat so the finish looks flat. If you run into certain dents, dings, and holes that can't be steamed out or sanded out, there's a lot of fillers that you can use. You can use a variety of glues and sawdust mixed together, like the yellow glues, super glue and sawdust, epoxy and sawdust, hide glue and sawdust. You can even use epoxy, super glue, or hide glue as a clear fill all by itself without sawdust. I like to use this wood filler. It's water-based and cleans up real easily, and an advantage that it has is it takes a stain, whereas most of the other glues won't take a stain. But we're not worried about stains right now. Sometimes I'll use a Bondo type material from the pattern making shops called Tough Fill. It comes in a pine and mahogany color, and if you stop by your local pattern shop, they'd probably loan you a little bit. I've made some dents in this body here to fill with some of the various wood fillers. Whatever kind of filler you use, you want to do it early in the sanding stage so that it gets sanded along with the rest of the wood. I'll fill that one with clear super glue. You don't want to get too much glue on the surrounding wood because it'll sort of stain it and it won't necessarily look like the finish. Here I've got super glue in the hole and I'm putting some sawdust on top of it and packing it down. You can press it in with your finger, sort of like the dentist does a filling on your tooth, and add some more. There's a drop of epoxy. It's the 5-minute kind because I don't want to take overnight for it to dry. It's best to use 24-hour cure, but 5-minute works pretty well. And here's a little of the water-based filler, sometimes called wood dough. Now I'm mixing a little fresco powder, some red, yellow, and brown, into my wood dough to give it the alder color. You can use fresco powders to color a lot of the fills, the Bondo, sawdust, wood dough, what have you. That should match pretty good. This is the Tough Fill Bondo type material, pine and mahogany. I'm blending them for a color, and then I'll mix in a little bit of the cream hardener. This will harden in about a minute. That too will make a good fill. You'll have to experiment with the various fillers to get the right color and get the look you want. During this wood prep stage, it's a good idea to get a damp rag, squeeze the excess water out, and wet the wood down. This is called damp sanding. The purpose is to get the fibers of the wood to stand straight up, and when they're dry you can cut them off with sandpaper or a scraper. I do this 2, 3, maybe even 4 times as you progress through the various stages of sandpaper. Your 120, 220, 320, maybe even 400. Let that dry about a half an hour and then you can sand it. This close-up gives you a real good idea of how those fibers will stand up once they got wet. You can scrape them and shave them off with your sandpaper now. Now let's look at the wood fillers, the paste wood fillers that we use on open pored woods like mahogany, rosewood, ash, and walnut. We won't use them on maple, spruce, or alder because they're closed pored and don't need fillers. One filler is oil-based. Behlen's makes it, and it thins with naphtha. It comes in brown and natural, but you can color it with fresco powders to alter the shades. For example, a Les Paul or an SG Cherry Red is often done with the wood filler. These fillers take overnight drying before you can spray over them. Most of us wait almost a week before we spray over them, however, to be sure the solvents are dried. Here's a water-based wood filler from Hydrocoat. It's fast dry. That means you can spray over it the same day. It dries in an hour and a half. You thin it with reducer, flow-out additive, or water, and you can color it with the base concentrates. We're going to use both of these fillers now. This is the oil-based filler in natural that I'm using here. With a stiff brush and a rag, I'm working it down into the grains. When you first open it, get all the liquid stirred into the solids. Those are your solvents, and if it's too thick, you can thin it with naphtha till it's like a thick cream. You can be real sloppy with it. In fact, you might as well be because it's really messy. Wear gloves and keep a respirator on, or else have good fresh air coming in the window. I'm wiping the filler off now. I've waited about 5 minutes till it starts to haze. If you wait too long, it'll dry on you, then you can't get it off at all. If that happens, wash it down with a little naphtha because that's the solvent. The idea is to go cross grain and force the wood filler down into the pores while you wipe it off the surface of the wood. Later on you can sand it if you have to. There's 2 ways of filling grain. One is to just wipe it off like I'm doing here and do such a good job that you don't need to sand. The other is not to worry about it so much and sand it back down, which means you've brought yourself back down to the wood surface and left the filler in the pores. Takes a lot of elbow grease. And don't try to do the whole thing at once. I'm doing just one side at a time. I'll do the rims later too. I'll do them by themselves because if you do the whole body, it'll dry on you and you'll be in trouble. Any coarse rag is good to remove the filler from the grain. This is a piece of cheesecloth and it's doing a good job. I've got this filled and pretty much wiped off, so let's try some of the water-based filler. Basically the same idea, but you can't do too big an area for sure with water-based because it dries really fast, much faster than the oil-based paste wood filler does, and it doesn't remove as easily. In a couple minutes this will be dry and all chalked over. In fact, it's kind of drying on me right now, so I put a little reducer on the rag just to mush it around and thin things out and keep it liquid while I get it on the whole surface. Wipe cross grain and push it into the pores. With the water base, it's really important to get as much off as fast as you can. Once you try it, you'll know what I mean. I'll be sanding this off as soon as it's dry. But I don't have to wait a week either. I can sand it in an hour. See how that's chalking over and turning sort of whitish? It's dry. While this is drying, let's take a look at that ash body. You can see along the edge where I've actually missed some of the pores. That's all right. You can fill 2 or 3 times if you have to. I'm just going back over this and very delicately wiping off some of the excess. There's a good close-up of what a filled pore looks like. Those streaks that you see going sideways, that is actually what's laying on the surface of the wood. If you take your lamp and move it around, it'll show you the areas that you haven't gotten from the reflection. There's an area right there, that cloudy area, that's wood filler that needs to get wiped off. When you can no longer wipe it, that means it's totally dry, and all you can do then is sand it off. That's not really true, Dan. At any time during the filling stage, if things dry up on you or clog, you can cut back into the filler with the right reducer. You may have to refill it again, though. And sometimes you'll fill 2 or 3 times. That's normal to get a good flat surface. Filling is such an important part of the wood preparation stage. That's why I'm spending so much time on it. We're not done yet. I've got more to show you. When you're sanding wood fillers of either type, sand with the grain, not cross grain. When you have a wet filler, you wipe it off cross grain because that tends to keep it in the pores and not pull it out. But you've got to sand it lengthwise with the grain, or else you'll be scratching the wood. By the way, I'd like to point out that this guitar is not typical of my work. This is sort of a guinea pig. That's all it is a practice piece to work on. It's not a real guitar. This is a picture of that wood I just sanded. If you look closely, you can see the air pockets that didn't get filled. It wouldn't be a bad idea to thin down some more Hydrocoat filler and wash this one more time. In other words, fill for a second time. Try this experiment. Spray some lacquer on a piece of mahogany or other open-pored wood, but not on the other half, because when you fill wood, it's going to stain the wood. The Martin Company seals rosewood, for example, before they put the wood filler on, so it won't stain the wood. Now I'm going to put on some wood filler on both halves, and watch the difference when I wipe it off. You might want to think about that when you're filling wood. Do you want it to stain the wood or don't you? This side was protected by the wash coat of sealer. This side wasn't, and it took the stain much darker. Well, let's wrap up this section on wood filling now, even though there's probably more we could work on. You practice at home and figure it out for yourself. Try Hydrocoat, try the oil-based. Try it on bare wood, try it on sealed wood. When you seal the wood, if you're going to use the Hydrocoat finish, of course you're going to seal with Hydrocoat. And use the Hydrocoat wood filler. Don't use oil-based wood filler underneath Hydrocoat. That does not work. However, you can use the Hydrocoat wood filler under lacquer. That's something you should know about. Now it's time to get on to spray finishing. To start off this section on spraying, I wanted to show you my desk lamp holder in case you wondered what it was anyway as it hangs off the bench. This allows me to put my lamp anywhere I want as I work, and it gives me good light while I spray, and it allows me to put the lamp behind me while I spray, especially with lacquer because you wouldn't want to get an explosion. I always turn this lamp off and unplug it. With Hydrocoat you don't have to worry about that because it's non-flammable. The guitars that we've worked on up till now for the filling and the sanding stages we won't be using again. We're going to focus on these two little mini guitars because they're a good size to spray, they'll fit in the camera well, and they're both made of alder, which finishes beautifully. We'll do one in Hydrocoat and one in lacquer. Blow all the dust out of the pores. I should have told you this earlier actually. Whenever you're doing wood finishing, blow down the wood before you wood fill it too. Because if sawdust is down in the open pores, the filler won't stick too well. and if sawdust is in there at this stage, it can cause air bubbles and pinholing. You'll probably see a little of that later. The Hydrocoat body, I'm going to seal it with a rag. I don't always do this, but you can do it. It saves dirty in the guns, and we've been told by the manufacturers that it's not a bad idea on plain wood because it keeps pinholing down, which is air bubbles trapped by the sprayed finish. You could also spray on the Hydrocoat sealer. If you wipe the finish on, use a little flow-out additive, just a little bit, because it lets it dry a little bit slower and makes it easier to wipe on. Flow-out is a type of retarder. As soon as that first wiped-on sealer coat dries a little bit, I'm coming into all the holes with the Q-tip and some sealer, and I'm sealing the wood grain, all the side grains. Seal all the end grain and side grain. When you poke a Q-tip down into a hole, fluid can run out like that. Be careful of that and be prepared to wipe it up, especially with lacquer because it cuts its own self. Lacquer redissolves itself a little quicker than Hydrocoat does. We do this really early in the wood stage so that we don't have to do it later and mess up our good finish coats. Sometimes I'll use a pipe cleaner to get in the small holes. It seems to be a common problem with people just starting out finishing that when they get all done to the wet sanding stage, the wet sanding lubricant water or what have you, mineral spirits is used also, runs underneath the lacquer around the edges of these holes, and then the finish will blister off. As for this little guy, we're going to do him in lacquer. I'm going to start out with lacquer sanding sealer, but I could use clear lacquer to seal with too. All sealer really is clear lacquer with stuff added to it that makes it sand easy. Lacquer is a lot tougher to sand. I'm adding some thinner to it, 50-50. I always thin lacquer 50-50, 1 part thinner to 1 part lacquer, or 1 part thinner to 1 part sealer. That's very normal. All sealer really is any coat that you spray on the wood, any first coat, it's going to prime the wood. Sealer might have more meaning if you were spraying color coats, perhaps, where you want to seal the colors in from the top coat, something like that. It's just a word that we use. A lot of us use clear lacquer to seal with because we feel that it has a clearer finish and it has less possibility of ever checking or cracking. That's sort of a moot point. I go back and forth. That's sealer, and that's lacquer, just for your information, to show you the difference in what they look like before they're sprayed. Once they're sprayed, it's not that drastic. I'm going to use my Miller 2000 to put the sealer on. And speaking of the Miller, there's a couple things you might want to know. This is my favorite one. It comes with the Miller outfit. There's another one that's a little bigger with a pint jar. It sprays pretty much the same as this one. Perhaps it lays out a little more fluid. It certainly holds more fluid. These are known as bleeder. The air comes out this top hole and it doesn't spray till you put your finger on it. There's another airbrush that Miller sells with the aerosol kit that has a push button on it. That's called a non-bleeder. Otherwise you'd lose all the aerosol in a hurry. While these are very similar, they both have a different sized hole in the air tip. That's this part right here. And they do seem to spray a little differently. If I had to take my favorite, I would take the bleeder. I've used one for 15 years and I'm just used to it. I'm going to be spraying with the large fluid tip. That's this brass part that you see here. There's 2 tips with it, a small one and a large one. I'll be using the large. As far as spraying technique goes, you'll really want to develop your own. A lot of people believe that you should trigger on and come across the piece and then trigger off, trigger on and come across and trigger off. I don't really do that. Once I get a good spray going, I just keep it going. These smaller airbrushes, especially the Miller, have a somewhat tendency to spit, so I just like to keep it running. I think the reason that you trigger on and off is to save material. Well, I'm not using that much and I'm just not worried about it. Your first coat of sealer can be sprayed fairly heavy and you don't have to worry too much because it won't run yet. It'll soak right into the wood. You control the fluid by raising or lowering the tip. The air comes out of this air tip and goes across the fluid tip. When I was talking about spitting, it's just starting to spit right now because it's running a little low on fluid. I'm going to stop and fill up. Spitting means when it's splattering is what I mean. And if you trigger on or trigger off, do it off the instrument, off to the side. That's true with any spray gun though, not just the inexpensive ones. I control my air compressor turning it on and off with a foot switch. Sits on the floor. And I use that same foot switch to run my Dremel tool, by the way. See the spark on that air compressor? Because of that, you wouldn't want to run it too close to your spraying like I am here. This is only for example. Put your compressor behind you when you spray, well away from the spray pattern. As soon as you're done spraying, run some thinner through the gun so your fluid tip doesn't get clogged. And I like to take a little pipe cleaner, put some thinner in it, and run it down that fluid tip just to keep it clean. Then I drop the tip into a jar of lacquer thinner with all the other tips and my little cleaning brush and let it soak for a while. Now let's check out that Hydro-Coat. That feels dry. It's been about an hour. I'll probably give this a real light sanding and then I'll spray it with Hydro-Coat. I'm going to use a couple of different spray guns on this guitar. I'm using a 280 grit wet or dry, the black stuff here, to sand out this first coat of Hydro-Coat sealer. I'm almost right back down to the bare wood because it all soaked in. I'm going to spray one more coat on this, and this white chalky stuff that you see is the solids they put in sanding sealer to make it sand easy. When you try it at home, you'll find lacquer sands a lot harder than sealer. Most of your sealer you sand all the way back off anyhow. I'm going to spray the Hydro-Coat, at least to start out, with this DeVilbiss door jamb gun. It's a medium-sized gun, and while it might seem big to the little Miller airbrush, it's small when it's compared to a production gun. I'm going to strain my sanding sealer, and I'm going to shake it up even though it tells you not to. How could I stir it in a bottle like that? I shake it up, strain it into my cup, and then let it sit for a while so the bubbles can settle out. They're just worried about getting bubbles in your finish. You always strain lacquer and you always strain Hydro-Coat, especially Hydro-Coat. It's very thick and it tends to clog. You can get these disposable paper strainers at your local paint store. These are the three guns that I probably use most often. There's a DeVilbiss, a copy of a Binks, and another DeVilbiss. The two smaller ones are what is known as door jamb guns, and this is a larger production gun with a quart cup, and these have pint cups. They basically work the same. They're what is known as an external mix gun, and they have one knob that controls the air and the fan pattern. The other one controls the fluid. If you lock both those knobs down, nothing would happen. Perhaps my favorite is the smaller DeVilbiss EGA 502. This is the air cap, and this is called the fluid tip. Inside the fluid tip is the needle, and when you press the lever, the needle moves back and forth and lets fluid out. This here is the fluid cap, air tip, and the needle that came with the gun. It's larger and it's a 70 thousandths hole. I took it out and special ordered in this smaller one, which is 40 thousandths, because the manufacturer of Hydro-Coat recommends that for spraying, and it does work better. It was a special order item. On the bottom of this gun, on the siphon tube, I have a small filter made of brass that I slide in there. That keeps any clogs from getting in my finish, and it's especially important on Hydro-Coat. By the time you see this video, we'll probably have them in stock, because I use scads of them. Now I've got this lamp plugged in because it's Hydro-Coat and it won't blow up. It's probably not the smartest thing in the world to do it. I don't know what could happen. And I've got this lamp. It's nice to have light to reflect off the body, and you can see your wet pattern going down. In the last scene when I sprayed the lacquer, I sprayed a little differently than I will now. Normally when I'm spraying, I spray the sides or the rims first, all the way around. Let's just watch me go here. I'm laying down a really smooth wet coat here in one smooth motion. I do trigger on and off a little bit like right here because I'm working on the rims and there's a tendency to run. What I'm trying to show in this scene here is an overlap method. As you come across each pass, let it overlap the pass before you so it dissolves any overspray that you might run into. Don't get these first coats too wet. This is Hydro-Coat and it's thicker than you think. If you're used to lacquer, this is something different. Not only does the overlap method take care of any dry overspray, the other reason for it, and probably the most important reason, is that when you spray clear finishes, you have a pretty wide spray pattern. This is your tip and that's the fluid coming out. It tends to be a little bit weaker on the outside edges. Let's say the thickest part of your clear finish is towards the center. By overlapping your coats, you can get an even paint thickness. If that was one coat, you'd overlap from a third to a half. Usually a third is about right. Your second coat would come along like this. And that way your coat will be even in thickness throughout. With the type of guns I'm showing you here, if you have your air cap horizontal, your spray pattern comes out vertical. If you put it vertical, your spray pattern comes out horizontal. When I tighten down that knob, I get the small pattern. Open it up and I get the wide pattern. I always adjust my fluid down to almost nothing when I'm starting out and add it gradually. Do that on a piece of scrap, and when it starts to run, back it off a little bit. This controls the fluid. With any spray gun, keep square and parallel to the work. Don't tip the can. Keep that air cap square to the work and don't swing through like this. Come across parallel to the work or you won't get an even film thickness. No swinging through like this. Right now I want to clean out this gun from Hydro-Coat real fast. You should do it as soon as you're done. These are the steps I'll take. I'll put the Hydro-Coat back into the container I got it out of, and then press the trigger and let that fluid come back out. Otherwise it's up inside the body of the gun. Put back on the air and run some water through it. Clear water. Unplug it and let that back out into the water. See how milky it gets? Do that a couple of times. Maybe 3 or 4 times. I removed the body of the gun and set it aside for a minute and dropped the top of the can in some water, as well as that little filter. Brush that down with a toothbrush. As for the body of the gun, I hold it over my water. I've always got a bowl of water around, and I use one of my little micro pipettes to put water into the body of the gun and let it flush out the tip. Remove the air cap and drop that into the water and keep on flushing till it runs pure. You'll have to press the trigger as you flush and it'll come right out the fluid tip there. Next, I drop the parts in a jar and put some brush and gun cleaner in there. And I'm wearing gloves at this point because it's a little caustic. And I'll dip my toothbrush in the brush and gun cleaner and kind of wash the parts down. I remove my gasket from the gun too. See how the Hydro-Coat sort of clings to it? It starts to get solid. And I use my acid brush to really brush down those parts. You've got to really clean Hydro-Coat every time. Finally put a little brush and gun cleaner through the gun body itself and flush that out. When everything's clean, run some clean air through the gun and dry all the parts off. It's good to have a spray gun when you're using Hydrocoat that's either made from aluminum or stainless steel in all its parts. Some of the cheaper imported guns probably aren't, and they could rust. These are the tools that I use to keep my gun parts clean as I'm spraying, and they're never far away from me. A toothbrush. You can dip that in thinner. A wire bristle brush for brushing off gun parts and getting off Hydrocoat in areas like threaded cup parts where it starts to harden on you. This is a cleaning brush for spray guns that goes down the siphon tube. I use lots of acid brushes because they're cheap and I can throw them out when I'm done. I use these knives that are meant for burning stick shellac and lacquers, and I use them to wrap rags around and stuff down inside jars of Hydrocoat and other colors when they harden and get them out of the cracks. A pair of hemostats is extremely important because it allows you to get parts out of thinner without putting on gloves or getting thinner on your hands. You've got to have a dental probe because you may need that to hook certain parts out that you can't grab otherwise. I use a lot of these pipettes. I clip the little tip off of them so they can run a lot of fluid through them in a hurry. The same pipettes that you use for super glue. I use a lot of pipe cleaners to clean small orifices, and several sizes of guitar strings I keep around to clean the Miller 2000. I'd been spraying for years before I found out that I didn't need all those wrenches when I was spraying because such a thing existed as a spray gun wrench. This wrench will fit all the parts on all the standard spray guns, at least the ones made in this country. A handy tool. I found that ammonia makes a good addition to the water for cleaning Hydrocoat. It's inexpensive and it saves you using a lot of brush and gun cleaner. It seems to take a Hydrocoat that's left inside of a can or on a part and gels it up, and it makes it hard and sticky so you can pull it off as a film and get rid of it. Now I'm going to take another look at the lacquer sealing job we're doing, and then we can go on to our first clear top coats. This is what the lacquer's done to those fibers on the wood. Just like the wet sanding, it stood them back up again even though I damp sanded 2 or 3 times. I'm just shaving them off with some 220 no-fill paper. When this is sanded out, it's ready for a top coat. The white powdery stuff, like I said earlier, is what they add into the lacquer to make it sand easy. That's what makes it a sanding sealer. I know that one of the things they add to the sandpaper that I'm using here that makes it sand easy, it's a free cut no-fill paper, is a stearate. Stearates make it sand easier. Stearates is also added to lacquer to make it a sanding sealer. That makes it sand easier. Now with the Hydrocoat product, we've been advised by the manufacturers not to use these no-fill, free-cut, stearated papers because it causes fish eyes or craters, similar to what you might see in a lacquer finish if you were to get silicone near it. I've had no trouble myself with the free-cut papers on Hydrocoat, but I'm warning you about it so you'll know about it. Definitely you should blow all the dust off after you're done sanding and wipe everything down with a damp rag to ensure that there's no stearates left on the surface. This shows you the effect of a silicone or perhaps a stearate under lacquer or Hydrocoat. That's what it'll look like. But the stearates won't bother lacquer. On Hydrocoat though, you're safest if you use the black wet or dry paper, even though it's harder to sand with. Or if you do use the blue stuff, blow it down real well with an air gun and damp rag that finish. I mean damp, not wet. You don't want to get Hydrocoat very wet in the early stages. If you're using a spray can to put your sealer on or your lacquer, follow the same techniques. 2 coats is plenty even with the spray can. But you may want to let it dry a little bit longer than you would if you used sealer that you mixed up and put in a real spray gun. So 1 can of this sealer goes a long ways. You could do a lot of little guitars with that. A question we get a lot is how many cans, if you're using a spray can, do you need to do a guitar? We always say 1 can of sealer is plenty and 2 cans of lacquer is plenty to do any guitar. Actually, 1 can of sealer would seal quite a few guitars because you only use 2 coats, and if it's put on right and sanded well, you'll get a good finish. I'm going to finish spraying this little guitar in the aerosol can with sealer, sand it out along with the Hydro-Coat, and we can get on with the clear. Now that you're ready for the clear coats, that final sanding of the sealer becomes important. Keep your eye out for areas like this around a pickup route or holes, because lacquer or Hydro-Coat tends to build up there, and if you don't get rid of it now, it'll be there throughout the whole finish. So I guess what I'm saying is that wood that's well sealed or properly sealed has been well penetrated with finish, sanded mostly back off to the smooth wood, and it's ready for the top coats to lay out on smoothly. We're going to spray the first coats of clear lacquer using the AccuSpray HVLP, high volume, low pressure. It uses a much larger air hose than a conventional air compressor, and it runs off a turbine instead of a compressor. This is the gun that goes with it. I mix my lacquer, 1 part lacquer to 1 part thinner. That's a 50-50. Some people call it 100%. And I'm going to hook up the AccuSpray at the other end of the shop, away from the spray fan and any of the fumes, because it's an electric motor. I'm using this optional flex connector that hooks onto the big hose, and it gives me a little more freedom of movement. The black knob down here controls the air to the gun, and these other 2 work like all the others. This could be the highest quality gun I've ever used. It really lays out a beautiful finish. If you'll notice, there's very little overspray. Unlike with lacquer, through a conventional gun, you'd see an awful lot of overspray. I'm double coating this. I went across once and sprayed what I call a tack coat, sort of dry, to give the next coat something to cling to. Because as the wood gets smooth from our sanding and wood preparation, it makes it slipperier, and that could cause a run easier. The reflection of that light shows me that I don't have any runs because I sprayed a dry tack coat that bites into the lacquer, and it gives the smooth wet coat something to hold on to, and you won't get any runs. The AccuSpray attaches pretty much like any other gun, and this black dial here controls the main flow of air to the unit. That's off, that's on, and I play with that air control. By balancing that against this, the fluid control, you can get the perfect pattern, and that's how you control overspray. Now I'm going to give this guitar a complete coat. I'm triggering a little bit here because it's really laying it on thick. But smooth, perfectly atomized. This is the same way I'd spray a big guitar, only this is lighter. I'm getting the rims. Now I'm going to start on the top. Now you notice I won't trigger on or off. I'm going right down that guitar, laying it out. I'm using my light to get a reflection so I can lay out the perfect coat. With a wet coat like this, it's a good idea to clamp it flat for a few minutes when the solvents flash off to avoid runs and sags. I'm using this close-up and the reflection of the ceiling lights to show you a phenomenon called orange peel. I probably got the orange peel in the finish because I was spraying it on too thick, and I might need to use some retarder because it's drying too fast on me. I'm going to add a little bit of retarder now. That's orange peel. That's a very wet coat. Actually, I sprayed 2 coats 5 minutes apart. The first coat was wet, I clamped it flat to dry for about 4 or 5 minutes, just till the solvents flashed off, and I hit it again. I'm really considering these 2 coats to be 1 coat though, and I'll let this dry all day and spray it just before I go away at the end of the night. That'll be my last job of the day. Get good ventilation and leave your fan on for a while because this is lacquer and it smells. I think I'll leave for about 20 minutes. Here's my first wet gloss coat of Hydrocoat. I'm showing you what's called pinholing. Those little specks are either trapped air or a little bit of sawdust. This isn't too bad, it'll level out and you can sand out any really bad ones. Notice the run that's starting right here on the edge. Lacquer or Hydrocoat always wants to build up around pickup cavities and on edges of the instrument. I picked up a run on the back side too, right here by the cutaway. Once again, it's on an edge. The finish is all sunk into the alder now, and what was really glossy and shiny in the last scene is sort of dry and scratchy almost now on the first coat. What I'm doing here is working down that hardened lump with my 3-cornered fret dressing file because it has round edges and a real smooth cut. Just kissing off the top. I'll follow that with a little bit of 280 or a fairly fine grit of the black wet or dry paper and further kiss down the top and blend it in. I'm not going to sand too much of the finish because I like to leave that tooth, a little bit of bite for the next coat to cling to. While I'm at it, it doesn't hurt to go around the whole body and just knock down any hardened lumps or dust specks. That wasn't really a sanding, I'm just kissing the tops there. Now I'm going to spray a coat of this clear Hydrocoat, unthinned, in the Miller, the 2000, in the pint-sized jar, the bigger one. I'm using one of the screens that we sell with the Badger outfit to keep out any clogs. Whoops, almost forgot my flow out. I always use about 1/4 ounce of flow out to a pint. I'm going to set that in a bowl of warm water because it's cool in here, and that'll warm it up to room temperature. Temperature is really important with finishes, especially the Hydrocoat. I keep a little weather station in the shop. It's got a thermometer, barometer, and hygrometer. Hygrometer lets you know how dry it is in the shop. Thermometer tells you the temperature, and this barometer lets me know if it's a good day to go fishing or not. Hydrocoat is supplied ready to spray, so you don't use a lot of reducer. It sprays right out of the can. What I do use often is flow-out additive. The main uses for this, and it's a retarder, and a retarder means that it slows down the drying time. I've used retarder for years with lacquer because on a moist day with lacquer, if you do too much spraying, you can trap moisture and you get blushing. Well, you add a little retarder to it, and it slows down the time, and that moisture can escape. You don't have moisture problems with Hydrocoat. It's actually the exact opposite, even though it's a retarder. I wouldn't use flow out on a moist day. I wouldn't need it. I might use a little bit of reducer on a moist day. This improves the flow. That's why I use it. 1/4 ounce per pint at the most, just a little dollop. And it gets a better flow to the finish, a more level finish. It also fights fish eyes and silicone problems and the stearate problem if you get one from the sandpaper. It also improves bite back, and it allows the coat that you're spraying to bite into the coat before it better. And Hydrocoat's a little weak on bite back. It's not quite as good as lacquer. You might use flow out in a dry situation when your shop's very dry and warm to slow down the drying time so that it won't skin over, to let what little bit of moisture is in there escape. Now the reducer, I don't use a lot of this, but I might use it when it's really cool out. If it's really cool, this gives you a better flow. Once in a while you might use it as a thinner for if you're having trouble spraying it. I don't have trouble spraying Hydrocoat even with the Miller 2000, as you'll see in a moment. So with Hydrocoat, using the flow out would help to improve the flow of the finish. It fights fish eyes from stearated papers or silicones, gives you better bite back between coats. You might use it in a very dry shop. It's a retarder, but you use it differently than you do lacquer retarder. Hydrocoat reducer is usually used as a thinner if the viscosity is a little too thick and you're having trouble spraying, or if the shop's really cool. With the reducer or flow out, the manufacturer recommends up to 1 ounce per quart. As I said, I usually use about a 1/4 ounce per pint. I go a little weak on it. I've sanded out this body to a nice dull satin, and I'm going to spray a coat of clear gloss Hydrocoat using the Miller. I'm cleaning out the tip with a guitar string because Hydrocoat tends to build up on any spray orifice, especially the Miller, because it shoots air across the fluid tip. And when I say something like, I don't have any trouble spraying Hydrocoat, that's not really true. And as I do have troubles, I'm showing them to you on video. And I don't mean to slight Miller when I say even with the Miller 2000. But I'm certainly willing to admit that the Miller outfit is definitely a hobbyist outfit. But you can do professional work with it if you learn how to use it. I have for years. I always start with the rims first. And I've marked these coats, by the way. I'm numbering them. This is coat number 3 of clear gloss, so you'll know how many coats each guitar is getting. I'm getting a little spitting on the tip, so I keep a damp rag with flow out around and wipe it if that happens. A 50 thousandths guitar string is good for the heavy tip, and they don't always clog, and this is a good time to use a little flow out in the mixture. If they do, just stop and clean it. I'm marking the lacquer guitar for its 3rd coat. I'm going to spray that with the AccuSpray. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about safety. One nice thing are these shirt sleeve gloves that go all the way up the arm, and you can hold the guitar and spray and you won't get spray on your clothing. They're neat. I'm going to start wearing my spray mask whenever possible because you always should. It's hard to talk and video and all that with a microphone on. These are charcoal filters and they're rated for organic vapors. This is for lacquer. I keep a couple of those around, and you should too, at least one of them. When you buy them, they come in a plastic self-sealed bag, and you should always seal it up when you're done. That keeps the filter from losing its charge. Apparently those charcoal filters have a limited shelf life. I wear disposable dust masks when I'm sanding the dry powdered lacquer in between coats. I'm going to use the vapor mask now when I spray lacquer. Once again using the HVLP. That stands for high volume, low pressure. It uses a turbine instead of an air compressor, which is sort of like a vacuum cleaner in reverse. A large diameter hose, so it doesn't take a lot of pressure. You get a lot of lacquer spraying at the tip with a very low pressure from the airflow. That's why you don't get overspray. You get some, but nothing like you would with conventional guns. I'll tell you, the HVLP is great for spraying cutaways because it's such a gentle spray. You can really dial it down and control any runs or sags. If you look closely, I'm trying to show that there's very little overspray. I'm laying a wet coat on, but you can't see any overspray because I can't see any from where I'm standing. There just isn't any. On both of these guitars now, it's okay to start sanding because we've got 3 coats of clear gloss lacquer on it. I'm using a 280 or a 320 grit, something in that range, and I'm dust sanding it. That means sanding it until it's sort of dull looking and gets rid of all the shiny spots. Sand it all out till it looks like this. This is what I call a dull satin patina. Lay off the edges though with your sanding. Let the lacquer build up there because it'll need it. On the flats, you're looking for shiny spots. Don't expect to sand them all out. This is a good close-up of what they look like. Wood that uses wood filler will have less shiny spots. Wood that doesn't use filler, like alder, as it shrinks back into the grain, it produces shiny spots, and you've got to sand them out. I've still got a couple in this area here. It's sort of a hard thing to know when to quit. I'm quitting here. That's as dull as I can get it this time around. There's a few spots still left. On the Hydrocoat here, I found another handsome run on the edge. I probably wasn't paying attention. In a case like this, it might be a good idea to pull your gun out of parallel, and you'll get a little less buildup on the edges and avoid these runs. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Sand it out till it's satiny and dull, and try to get rid of the shiny spots. What you're looking at here is that ash body that we filled with wood filler earlier in the show. And I sprayed 1 coat of sealer on it with an aerosol can, sanded that back out with 220, and all I wanted to show you is how dull and flat it is. There's no shiny spots. I'm moving the lamps all over the place and I just can't find a shiny spot. It's because we had wood filler on this open pored wood and it's so flat. As you progress through the coats, the shiny spots will become less and less of a problem. This is the 4th coat of lacquer now, and it's laying out real nice. It's a little mottled, but that's just spray wave. I don't call that orange peel. If you look closely, you'll see that the black in the words lacquer and the first few numbers are weaker than over here. That shows you how much you actually sand back the lacquer each time you sand. The sanding is going to become more difficult once you get into the gloss. The chalking of the first coats of lacquer is because it melts with the sanding sealer, and you're still picking up some of the stearates or whatever it is in those sealers. Now the Hydrocoat has a more grainy look to it, and that's normal. You'll also notice that the black is stronger on the Hydrocoat because it builds more than lacquer, and it's protecting that black ink. This sort of a grainy pattern is fairly normal with Hydrocoat, and it'll sand out. At this stage of the game, I'm going to switch to a different type of sandpaper and be more careful because we're getting close to the last coats of lacquer. You can sand with the blue papers, the free cuts, especially on the lacquer and on Hydrocoat if you want to take the risk. Sometimes I do. Generally I don't. I wouldn't use anything under a 400 grit, and pretty much at this stage I stick to the Nikon Japanese finesse papers because they're such a fine grit they don't leave scratches. Speaking of scratches, any scratches that you do leave will be erased by the following coat because it'll melt the coat below it. A little less so on Hydrocoat because it doesn't bite back quite as well. The finesse papers come in grits from 400 all the way up to 2000. And when I get to the later stages of sanding, my wet sanding before rub out, I'll be using 1200 grit. Don't use anything under 400 at this point. I've got 4 coats on each of these now. That could be a finish coat for Hydrocoat. 4 coats, if it's done properly, might be the last coat you need. The lacquer I'll probably get 6 coats, maybe 2 more coats on it before I rub it out. At this point the sanding's pretty important. I'm sanding here with a 500 grit paper and I'm sanding dry. A lot of people would use water or mineral spirits at this point as a lubricant because it saves on paper. The liquid, as you dip it into a pan, washes the grains off. You can get rolling when you dry sand. That's little pieces of finish that build up on the paper. I wipe it off on my apron because you wouldn't want any balls on the sandpaper to scratch the finish. It'll scratch deeper than you want it to. When you're all sanded out smoothly before your final coats, you should dry wipe it down with a rag, get all the dust off and blow it off. You'll hear about a tack rag. It's a sticky rag that you can very carefully wipe over the surface. I mean just lay it on and it picks up hairs and lint. I don't use a tack rag too often because it can leave little smears on the finish, and you shouldn't use it on Hydrocoat. The manufacturer suggests not using tack rags on Hydrocoat. It can cause problems. A dry rag will do fine, and blow it down with an air gun. A minute ago I told you that you could avoid those runs if you pull the gun out of parallel. Parallel is when you stay the same distance from the piece as you come across. If you make the sweep away, like I told you not to do, you will get a little less buildup on your edges. A lot of books that I've read on spraying advise triggering on and off each time you make a pass. When you get off the workpiece, trigger. Come on, trigger off. I don't always do the trigger off method, and the main reason to do it is to keep your back spray from curling around behind the instrument and perhaps ruining a good gloss that you built up there. Every once in a while when I'm spraying, I'll take my holding stick off and spray the body cavity here so it gets some finish too. You'll notice that my stick is undercut, so there's a hollow space here and the lacquer tends to roll around the edges there. I wouldn't want to build up a sticky film that sticks to my holding stick. This acoustic flat top I'm stripping for a refinish. The techniques we're using on the 2 little guitars would apply to an acoustic guitar as well. We're not going to spray this here. I tend to do acoustic guitars or mandolins, any acoustic instrument, in clear lacquer only and stay away from sealer. Spruce doesn't need any filler, and you always want to put only clear lacquer on spruce. because I think the tone is better. When you're preparing acoustic woods for a finish, you'll still go through the damp sanding stage, but don't soak the wood down because it's so thin. You wouldn't want the water to penetrate down into the wood too deeply. It would be nice to spray a flat top or a mandolin, but there just isn't time on this tape. I chose the two small solid bodies because it would give me the best chance to demonstrate the guns and the clear finishes and the basic techniques. Now I'd like to use the Badger 150 airbrush to spray a coat of lacquer on this maple neck, something our customers do all the time. The 150 kit comes with everything you need to spray. You get a hose, a small spray gun wrench, the extra jars, small and large, 2 extra tips and needles. It even comes with a small holder for the airbrush. There's a protective cap to protect your tip, and you ought to use it. It mounts on the jars by a pressure fit, and there's also a gravity cup that comes with it for small amounts of colors or for touch-up work. We have a lot of accessories for the airbrush, like the heavy-duty tip and needle, extra caps, caps for your jars, extra siphon hose, these little screen filters that go right in the jar. Have plenty of glass jars, you can't get enough of them. And there's even a little moisture trap, and it's a good idea to use that. To install a moisture trap, you cut the hose about 2 feet from the airbrush and put the trap on with the 2 clamps which are supplied with it. The hose attaches to the airbrush right here, and the other end could be powered by a Miller 2000 using this adapter, or with this adapter you could run it to a standard 1/4-inch air line. To operate the airbrush, you press this button and that lets the air out. If you pull back on it, you add fluid. That makes it great for touch-up work because you can come in on a piece, add the air, and very gradually give the fluid with great control. I generally run my airbrush between 10 and 20 pounds. So I'm going to drop my pressure down to about 20 pounds. I spray lacquer about 35 to 45 pounds, hydrocoat about 50 to 55, but I drop it way down for the airbrush and bring it up gradually. Airbrushes are just fun to use, and they really come in handy on touch-up work too, as you'll find out in a later date when you start dealing with sunbursts and colors. When I spray a neck, I'll usually spray the peg head first and the other end, then I'll hang it up and get the middle. I put my shirt sleeve glove on, and the lacquer dries so fast I can touch the very bottom of it already and turn the instrument while I'm spraying it. An airbrush does a really delicate job on a maple fretboard so you don't get runs around the frets. This is the large tip I'm spraying with. As soon as you're done spraying, run some thinner through that tip right away. Sometimes I'll remove that tip and drop it right in some thinner. Get my little wrench out and take that part off too. Keep them clean. Here I've switched from the lacquer to some hydrocoat. You could spray a whole body with an airbrush using hydrocoat or lacquer. Hydrocoat tends to clog the tip up a bit though, more than lacquer would. It's just something about its viscosity. The tip's starting to clog on me here. If you look in the air cap, you can see it laying in there, the fluid's just resting in there, and that makes it sputter a bit. If that happens, hang up the instrument for a second and pay attention to the air cap. Get a pipe cleaner and wipe it around the needle. I'm running some lacquer thinner through here. Pull the trigger back and it'll squirt out. Cleaning your airbrush is more important than any other spray gun. It's so tiny and delicate. Really take the time to do it right. These pipettes are the perfect tool. Yeah, you got to keep those spray guns clean. I'm about ready to go on to wet sanding and rubbing out now. Before we leave spraying, I wanted to show you this little Lazy Susan that I sometimes use. I can put a neck on there and get a really level coat on a maple fretboard, or I can do a whole body on it if I was having troubles with runs. Sometimes I might choose to lay it flat. I'm going to spray my 5th coat of lacquer on this body now and leave the Hydrocoat alone at 4 because it's fine. One last coat with the AccuSpray, which turns out to be the best spray gun I've ever used. If you're looking for a system, you might really want to look into it. It doesn't do away with an air compressor because it's not a blowgun, for example, but it puts out a continuous flow of air so you can use it as a blowgun. And of course you couldn't run air tools on it, and that's probably the biggest reason why I'd want to have both of them. I'm using it here as a blowgun just to blow any dust off. And now I'm just going to spray a coat. I haven't really gotten to the rub out stage yet, but I have started to wet sand. Only on the lacquer. I'm using 800 grit Niken paper, and I really want to level out all those mottled pitty looks to a smooth finish this time. Sometimes I'll use a little rubber squeegee that you can get at the auto parts store to get the water off in a hurry and check the levelness of the finish. I also use these white tack sponges sold by Meguiar's to soak it up. It's kind of like a chamois cloth. I want to keep excess water out of the holes from soaking down into the grain and causing any problems. And you dip the sandpaper in water often to wipe the particles off. That's a hair caught in the finish. Whether you're dry sanding or wet sanding, this is the right time to start picking up any hairs, lint, or dust specks. I'm going to sand this finish out till there's no more mottled or orange peely look at all. There's a little sink in the finish here. It's actually a dent in the wood, and the finish follows it. We're going to do a drop fill to level this off, because if we don't, it'll show in the final finish. I'll first do a drop fill with lacquer, then clean it out and do the same drop fill with super glue to show you two methods. With lacquer, use a brush and just touch it onto the dent, laying a little pool. Most of this will shrink back in, and you may have to do it 2 or 3 times. I'm going to dab it out of here now, dry it off, and do the same fill with super glue so you can see the 2 different methods that I would use. Super glue is a much faster fill. It hardens right away. I'm going to use a spritz of accelerator for the super glue fill, accelerate the surface, and then wipe it off. In fact, I even sand it lightly with some 800 paper or 1000 grit to make sure there's none left on the surface before I do my fill, and I wait a few minutes for it to dry before I lay the super glue in there. I'm going to use the medium viscosity yellow label and just place a dab of it in there. That's all you need. And it'll harden from the bottom up because the accelerator's down in there. It won't hurt to put a little bit of accelerator on top of it too to help the cure. Now I'm using one of these finesse blocks to very carefully level that super glue fill, which could have been a lacquer fill, and you're probably a little safer. I've got a lot of good experience doing this, so I feel pretty confident. Down to the lower left center you can see that fill. That's a super glue fill, and this all took less than 4 minutes. Now I'll sand that out with the 800 paper as if it never happened. That got me out of a jam. Sometimes if I'm using these fine grits of 800 and up, I'll even go in a circular fashion. I'm going to wet sand this whole thing out till it's smooth, and I'll give you a good look at it. Keep drying it off as you go. Don't let the water get down in the holes. You've got to rinse often in lukewarm water and wipe the particles off with your thumb. I'm using that sponge backing pad, and I could sand out a whole guitar with this one little piece. The wet sanding gives it a really smooth feel. There's that fill that we made earlier right there, and you can barely see it anymore. And I do have one shiny speck left right there. I'm not going to sand after it though, because you've got to know when to quit sanding. This wet sanding could have been done dry. It just saves you a lot of time and elbow grease. Now I'll spray one final coat, as I mentioned earlier, because I think it needs it. We've had 5 already now, and I'll spray a finish coat here of 4 parts thinner to 1 part lacquer. I learned about this at the Gibson Guitar Company. That's 1 part lacquer. You can go a little heavy on the lacquer and the rest thinner. It's approximately 4 parts to 1. Maybe a little shy. Now you couldn't just use straight thinner because that'd be too thin. The lacquer gives it a binder. When Gibson does this, they go right onto their buffing machine. They don't even wet sand afterwards. I won't guarantee that we're going to do that because we don't have that giant buffer. In fact, I can guarantee we're not going to do it. I'm just showing you this technique so that you'll know about it. I don't always use it, and the main reason I do use it is because it gets such a good glossy flow out and it makes my wet sanding less later. I don't have to sand as much because the finish is smooth and flowed out. Now I want to get the Hydrocoat job and catch us up to it here, and then we can wet sand and rub out. Here I'm sanding out the Hydrocoat with 1200 grit Nikken paper dry. You can wet sand at this time too, and I probably will, but you've got to wait a minimum of a week if you wet sand with water. Dry sanding has its problems too, such as rolling and balling of the paper. There's a clog forming right there. You've got to keep those removed or they'll scratch your finish, and you wouldn't want to scratch it now. Wet sanding, on the other hand, solves that problem. If you wet sand with Hydrocoat, you've got to keep the finish dry at all times. Don't just leave the water sit on there. And as I said, wait quite a while before you use water on it. What I mean by quite a while for wet sanding is 30 days. It takes 30 days for Hydrocoat to cure. If you wait 2 weeks, it's not going to be as well cured. If you wait a week, you're pushing it. Here I've waited 2 days because I have to push it for the video, and that could cause me some problems. The types of problems that I run into with wet sanding uncured Hydrocoat is that the water works itself into the top layer of finish and causes it to separate from the layer below because it hasn't cured and totally formed a film throughout. I'll show you what I mean if I can make it happen here. What you're looking at here is what we call a witness line. Right along there, and I've sanded through 1 layer of Hydrocoat into the one below it because they haven't formed a perfect bond yet. It takes 30 days for that to happen. And I've said earlier, the bite back of Hydrocoat isn't as good, so you've got to give it time to cure, and then it'll be fine. If this happens to you, it could be repaired, but you'll have to spray another coat. What you do is airbrush a little Hydrocoat on this edge, let it dry, sand it out, and then spray another coat on the whole instrument, and be darn sure to wait 30 days. These are very similar to a sand through in lacquer, where you go through the lacquer and hit the wood. With lacquer, each coat totally dissolves the coat below it, so you don't get these witness lines. So the best thing is to use dry papers. Always wait as long as you can. And once you do get a witness line, stop. Don't do anything more and wait the full 30 days. Often they'll go away. Where you once sanded through, if you wait 30 days, the full cure time, you may find that you'll be able to buff it out. Otherwise, no amount of buffing will get rid of a witness line. Whoops. I think I used a bit of a too coarse of paper there. I sanded through on this lacquer finish. Right on the edge is where it usually happens. Now this could be touched up with lacquer thinner, a little super glue, or you could spray it with your airbrush because lacquer really melts in well. So sand throughs on wood where you go through the lacquer to the bare wood aren't such a problem. You're not apt to sand through a coat of lacquer into another coat of lacquer because they totally dissolve themselves. I know the first thing I'd do is just touch a little thinner to it and melt it back in, using the thinner almost like glue. Then I'd follow that with my airbrush and spray a little fresh lacquer onto it. But I'm not going to do that now because that'll come on a later tape. Now it's time to get on with the rubbing out. Be sure to use the right tools for the job, and here they are. Meguiar's has a lot of products for rubbing out finishes, and this is by no means all of them. This is the ones that we've experimented with, and from this bunch we've chosen number 10, number 7, number 4, number 3, and number 2. If I could choose only one, I'd take the number 7 as a general polish and rub out, but I use all of them. A typical rub out sequence might be sand to 1500 grit or 2000 grit and rub out with number 7. Or you might sand to the same grit and start with number 2, progress to number 3, and call that your final rub out. Some people would go from 2 to 3 to 7. After any final rub out, you use the 10 as your swirl mark remover, and it's also good on plastics. Number 4 is fairly coarse, and we used it a lot in the old days as a rubbing compound. Use that if you just sand out to, like, say, 600 grit. You'll need that to get the scratches out. The best thing you can do is try all of them and find out what works best for you. Of these 5 polishes, number 2 is the only one that was especially formulated for the high-tech polyesters or car finishes, but it works well on lacquer too. The rest were formulated for conventional lacquer finishes. You can use them by hand or by machine, and when I speak about machine, I mean a buffing pad. I'm using these foam finesse pads that has a threaded mandrel that will go in your electric drill. This adapter goes in a 1/4 inch drill. Here's another idea. I took a piece of 5/8 threaded rod, the same size as the adapter, and turned it down, and then threaded the turned down portion so it fits into my Makita disc grinder. Then I can use the disc grinder because it has more power and a real handy shape to do my buffing. I plugged the disc grinder into this 10 amp variable speed control made by Dayton for the Grainger Company, model 4X701. The disc grinder runs at 4,500 RPMs, which is way too fast for buffing, and the variable control allows me to bring it down to the 700 to 1000 RPM range, but still retain all the torque. Using the electric drill or the disc grinder, be sure to use a different pad for every number of mirror glaze. I tamped the finesse pad onto the material to get it on the foam. Here I'm using the disc grinder. You got to keep moving and keep a backlight so you can see by the reflection how your buff's going. I'm going to change my speed here, starting slow, and I can increase it as I go. At any time during the rub-out stage, if you find some scratches, a piece of lint, or you just don't think it was smooth enough, stop and do some more wet sanding. That's why the wet sanding is so important, is to prepare you for the rub-out, to get rid of any scratches. Here I'm working out an imperfection with the finesse block, a little piece of lint, or something that was in the finish. This is pure grit in a block, and they're gentler than sandpaper, and they do a perfect job of working down high spots. You keep these in water all the time and only take them out when you need them. The finesse blocks are color-coded. They come in 5 different grits from 400 to 3000. You keep them in water all the time, and you can use them to finesse out small imperfections in the finish, like this piece of lint that I found here. They've saved my life more than once. I love them. I like these tack sponges because they absorb well and they don't lose their body like a rag often does. Back to my buffing. I rub the cutaways by hand using some lint-free cloth because that's the only way that I can get at them. Sometimes I'll buff out the whole guitar by hand, and you can do that easily just because it feels good. Keep your rag pinched into a ball like this, which we call a French polish tampon. Or with the large rag, use the palm of your hand to buff out large areas like this. When you're buffing the Hydro-Coat, don't touch it too soon after you've polished it, and don't dry rag polish it too quick either, because it gets warmer than lacquer and it can take a scratch for a few minutes. Let it cool off. I'm putting the number 10 in there now and wiping it off with a separate dry rag, and I hold it into a little tampon and move real fast. By taking my focus off of the wood and onto the reflection, you can get a good idea how glossy Hydro-Coat is. But when I'm rubbing it out by hand, I really like to hold it in my lap whenever possible, especially for the cutaways. And whether or not you're buffing by hand or by machine, once again, lay off these edges. They don't need much sanding or buffing. That's where you're apt to go through. The gloss is already built up on them. Here's a little shop-made buffer that I bolt onto my milling machine. It uses the stick rouge. This wheel is for my red. That's the first compound I use. You load up the wheel with a little wax or rouge and buff like so. But you've got to be careful with the wheel not to drag the piece or to burn through your finish. Burn throws are common on the wheel as you're learning to use them. If you loosen the set screw on this mandrel, the buff comes off and I can put the white buff on. All this is a washing machine motor down below here, a little wooden frame, a couple of pillow blocks, and a shaft and pulley. These are 12-inch diameter unstitched flannel buffs. I stack them up to about 3 inches wide. If you thin down the stack, you can buff in cutaways. Anyhow, that's my little homemade professional buffing rig. If you'd like to make one, I got the shaft and the pulleys as a kit at the local hardware store. Put on a 6-inch shaft pulley, a 2.5-inch motor pulley down in there, and it's a 1/4 horsepower 1725 RPM washing machine motor. All these buffing methods will do a good job if you wait long enough for the finish to cure and sand with a fine enough grit. Here's a reminder on buffing then. After 1200 to 2000 grit paper, start with number 7 and go to number 10, the swirl mark remover, or go right in order from 2 to 3 to 7 to 10. That's the full schedule, or any combination that you like. I wear a dust mask when I'm buffing too, because there's a lot of dust that gets in the air, especially on that big pedestal type buffer. I've about covered all the subjects that I wanted to in teaching you about clear finishing, and before we say goodbye, I'd like to review a few points that I thought of while I was watching the video. Tape over a rosewood fretboard if you're going to spray that type of neck. Don't spray over it, and don't get overspray on it. Rub out the smaller projects by hand, especially necks. You don't need a power buffer for these. When you use a finesse pad, you can burn through with this too, so be careful on the edges. If you tilt like that, you'll burn off an edge. You can burn off an edge by hand too. At the buffing stage, you must be careful, and practice is your best experience. We all get burn-throughs while we're learning. I almost always spray in a vertical pattern, but sometimes I dial it down to a round pattern for spraying small areas. But normally I use the vertical pattern, because a small pattern is handy on the edges of instruments and in the cutaways. If you're spraying lacquer and it's a moist day and you forgot to add any retarder, keep a can of aerosol blush eraser around. And if you get a blush, which is a whitish grayish look and quite hard to see on clear, hit it with a coat of this. That'll let the trapped moisture escape. A friend of mine said that he had trouble knowing when his fan pattern was adjusted right, that by the time he got it adjusted he'd be done spraying the piece. My answer was, practice on scrap. Never spray on the actual piece till you have everything perfect. That's why I keep around old bodies and necks, and you should too, to experiment on. Never, ever practice on the actual piece till you're ready. If you happen to use any of the high-tech automotive finishes, don't use them with lacquer. As a matter of fact, don't use them with Hydro-Coat either. And for that matter, don't mix lacquer and Hydro-Coat. In other words, try to stay within a system. If you're with us on one of the tapes coming up on colors or repair work, finishes as used in repairs, you'll get a chance to see how I keep all the various products organized, and perhaps seeing close up how somebody else keeps their shop organized, you'll pick up some tips that will help you out. I picked up this tip for stacking jars in a cardboard tube with its face sawed off at a friend of mine's repair shop. We'll be using these stains to do a sunburst like this in the tape on colors. This is Hydro-Coat, by the way. But for now, it's so long, and I hope this tape has helped you out with your finishing problems. See you next tape. Now maybe you'll think that finishing is fun.